Welcome everyone. It's already 5:15 sharp, and we're going to have 1 hour exactly for this meeting. So for this event, I think it's better if we start off. A warm welcome to this event entitled Rethinking the Built Environment in Connection with Our Energy System. This event is organized, sorry, okay. I hope you can hear me. The event is organized by the International Energy Agency with the support of the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, which is co-hosting this pavilion, the Women Business Coalition. My name is Luca Lore. I'm an international climate policy analyst at the International Energy Agency, and it is an honor for me to be the host of this important event. And last but not least, because it gives me the opportunity to breathe a little bit without the mask. This discussion will focus on the actions needed by governments, NGOs, industries, and international organizations to put buildings on track to net zero emissions. So in the next 50 to 55 minutes, we are going to first hear some opening remarks from our distinguished speakers here in the room. Then we're going to have a presentation from the IEA, from my colleague Thibault, on the IEA net zero emission scenario. And finally, a panel discussion with our distinguished speaker with a Q&A session at the end, if the time allows. So without further ado, I will now leave the floor to the first speaker, Tom House. Tom is the head of the Energy and Environment Division at the IEA, and his work involves leading the division and analyzing carbon pricing and other energy and climate policies, promoting best practices within IEA countries, COP26 and UN, and bringing all the IEA energies, transition expertise and analysis on projection, technologies, and policies to the support of successful COP outcomes. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad this hybrid technology is working. Once again, I'm from the IEA, and we're very happy to be joining you here today. The IEA, we always start by taking a very global view of everything. And we start from a very top-down approach. And with that, I don't know if any of you are familiar with our net zero report, which we published last year. And this gave the world a very detailed pathway of what the world needs to do to get to net zero. It looks at net zero in terms of emissions, but it also ensures that those countries who need to can still develop energy access, make sure that energy continues to be affordable, and make sure that energy continues to be securely supplied. So we combine all of these objectives with the objective function of delivering on net zero. And with this report, we explored what the implications are for the different technologies, the different materials, the different energy uses and industries all around the world. And we did a particular examination of the buildings industry. And there, the headline figure, of course, is that roughly 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with building in one way or another, with building use, with building construction, with building materials. So they're a significant part of emissions, and therefore they need to be a significant part of the narrative of developing net zero emission strategies. So we need the clear policies. Our report put forward about 400 policies overall of how to deliver on net zero, of which 50 were looking in particular at aspects relevant for the buildings industry. So that was our starting point, zooming in on what happened with the building industry. And from our survey of what goes on in terms of materials, equipment, efficiency practices, and so on, it's clear that the technology is available. So this is already an improvement on some sectors, which can be very hard to abate. For much of the building sector, there are a lot of good practices and materials and devices out there, technologies out there, which can help us deliver on these emissions reductions. So that's a good story. That the less good story is that we need the rate of application of these materials, these technologies, of these new building designs to happen at a rate far greater than we're experiencing today. We need 20%. In our model, we showed we needed 20% of total building renovations by 2030. And at the current track that we're going on, we get to 5%, not 20%. So there's a major scaling up needed in the efforts needed to renovate our building stock. So we come with these messages. We have our ideas of what best practice is, what the policies are, and who to talk to in different ministries and industries to help implement these policies. So we are very happy to be helping to put this advice out here, to put these messages out here, and to share this advice. And we're particularly happy to be coupling with, in this particular exercise, with the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction and the We Mean Business Coalition. So very happy to be here today. And for a deeper dive into some of the headlines I've just given you, I'm happy to pass over to our other speakers. So please, let me turn first to Roland Huntiger and then to Regis Meyer.
So thanks very much, Tom. And let me just introduce a couple of words for Roland. Roland is the director of Sustainable Buildings and Cities at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, based in Geneva, in Switzerland. And he leads the Transforming the Built Environment and Climate Action in Cities projects, and manages the council relationship with key networks and stakeholders, notably through the City Business Climate Alliance, a partnership with C40 and CDP that he helped create. He's a Swiss national, and he holds an MBA with distinction from INSEAD, France, and a master's in history and political science from the University of Zurich, Switzerland. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
I think they should hear you. If you don't hear us well, Thibaut, could you please let us know?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. It is an honor to do this event together with you at the IEA and also my fellow co-chair Regis. I'd like to particularly thank the IEA for your contributions every year to the Global Status Report on Buildings. We rely on the data that we have from your modeling and from all your work and analysis, and obviously also your role in the steering committee of the Global Alliance for Buildings. It is really a unique partnership we have. It is really this umbrella network that helps all of us, from business, from governments, from NGOs, from the international community, to put this sector on track. And I might need to review a little bit the numbers. We're at 37% now, I hear. I always use 40% because it's a but actually, I would like to just highlight a few of the key messages from this year's Global Status Report. The first is that emissions dropped for the first time by 10% in the built environment. However, this is mainly due to the pandemic. It is not due to structural changes and a real improvement. So far in the last few years, we have seen that energy efficiency is improving overall, but it is outpaced by the floor area growth because we are building at Paris a week. So there is change, but not at the system level and as we need to see it. So I'm afraid, but maybe already this year's numbers, certainly next year's numbers will again be higher if we do not act with the urgency that is required. So the 37%, it's about 13 gigatons. Let's not forget, it's a lot of CO2 every year. And about 70% of that is energy. So whether that is direct through oil, gas, coal firing to heat buildings, or indirect through electricity used in cooling. But 30% is the materials, the construction. And in new builds, that balance is 50-50. So we really have to take a full life cycle approach to building decarbonization. There are trade-offs. If we only focus on the energy piece and say, well, let's renovate, let's put in all that insulation material, it drives emissions somewhere else. So that's why we need to take a whole life and performance-based approach to decarbonize buildings. And importantly, this is a journey we need to do all together. The building sector is a very fragmented sector. A lot of short-term focus, cost focus. And so we need to see demand side signals. What we mean by that is when somebody decides to build or to invest, provide capital, or also a city decides to develop a new area, we have to look at the carbon emissions from the start, because that's when we have the biggest influence over reducing that. This morning, we had a really interesting session here at the COP. We launched our work around the market transformation for a net zero built environment, because to reach the targets that we are talking about, we need to reduce by 50% the emissions by 2030, and we need to be net zero by 2050. That really needs a market transformation. So the global ABC helps us drive that common vision. So we know what we need to do. And it helps us foster that collaboration. Those are the two enablers. And then we identify what we call the 3 key levers for that market transformation to happen. It's the whole life carbon. So we need to look at all the emissions. Come they from the cement and concrete that's used, from the steel that's used for buildings, be that through the construction process to improve the design, to use maybe less materials for the same ultimate purpose, and obviously the energy emissions, that we address them in a holistic way. The second is that we start treating carbon as we treat cost. So we need to look at the shadow cost today. We do not need an international trading system immediately. It would be great to have it. But if in every project we look at the carbon as much as we look at cost, and we start putting a value on that, that helps us change the decisions. And that triggers the third lever, which is changing those demand-supply relations, that we really incentivize the innovation up the value stream, up the value chain. We did some work on a report how investors and developers can put requirements for reduced carbon emissions at the start of projects. And if that happens, then the supply chain can deliver to that. And we see that in Europe, for example, there is a lot of emerging work from cities or from some countries in the Nordics. They start to put carbon limits on new developments. And that drives the market, if we can look at that holistically. I think it's interesting also maybe to expand a little bit the focus, and that's where the work of the IEA is also very important. Buildings, energy, and mobility can form a system that helps decarbonize mutually. We see a lot of interest today in the mobility sector. How do we drive the EV adoption through infrastructure, but also the connection to buildings, maybe as storage, as batteries, as grid backup? And that is probably an area that gives us a lot of potential to create also new value. Because we see, you mentioned the renovation challenge before. We are a bit stuck on renovation. We have been saying this now for years, that we are at that less than 1% renovation a year. And it's because that business case, the value case, is not clear. And I think I don't have the answer today, but we need to drive a new narrative, especially for renovation. And I think that's where that building, mobility, energy nexus can really help us to drive that. So I'd like to, maybe just from a global ABC perspective, close by saying that we're happy with where we've come in the 6 years since COP21 in terms of that common vision and really aligning stakeholders. I think the next phase is about national action. We are ready, and I know IEA is supporting some of the roadmaps in ASEAN. We have other partners helping us with the roadmaps for different countries, forming national alliances to really bring this work now to the local level. And maybe just to close that, the work you're doing for us at the IEA is really important to help us all. Thank you. And I look forward to the further discussions.
I think it's my pleasure to thank you for the nice work to the International Energy Agency work, and of course to my colleagues in particular who are involved with this. And there are a lot of substantive points that you mentioned that I hope we can come back to them later about carbon pricing, carbon limits. I think very interesting. Thanks so much for this information. Next, we have Régis Meyer, who works for the implementation and tracking of climate action agenda of the French Ministry for the Ecological Transition. He's deputy delegate for the French government to the Global ABC and to the PEEB. He participated in the elaboration of various global roadmaps for the low carbon transition of the real estate sector. So over to you, Régis.
Thank you. So I'm most grateful to be opening this expert discussion after Roland. In absence of Yves-Laurent Sapoval, co-chair for France for many years. I am representing France and the Ministry of Ecological Transition as a Global ABC co-chair. So this twin co-chairship of the Global ABC associating a private organization and a governmental organization exemplify for us the importance of the close collaboration between private and public in any transformation toward a zero-emission, efficient and resilient building sector. This close collaboration associated with a strong public engagement is especially needed in a sector which is mainly structured by isolated national or subnational markets, operated mainly by small and middle-sized enterprises, and dominated by a myriad of private investors. International collaboration also has a role to play to build bridge among stakeholders and accelerate this transformation in all countries. Global ABC has become a sectorial alliance that helps facilitate international initiative and cooperation to encourage greater ambition by government and deep market transformation in all countries, from industrialized countries to emerging economies and developing countries. Today, Global ABC gathers 34 countries, and among our most active countries, 2 members of them are represented in today's panel. I'm warmly grateful for representatives from Morocco and Senegal. Global ABC also gathers more than 160 organizations related to the building value chain, including investor and development banks. All members are engaged together to transform the building sector. I also would like to thank, again, the IAA for its active engagement into the Global ABC since our alliance was launched in 2021. In particular, the IAA support in helping achieve better visibility and understanding of the role of the building sector in the energy and carbon transition. The IAA is a major Global ABC member and has driven Global ABC flagship publications such as the yearly Global Status Report and the global or regional roadmaps published from 2016 before. So maybe sometime I wonder if the exercise you have carried out under the Global ABC was not a forefront exercise for the general, but you will answer. In any deep decarbonization pathway, energy demand sector will have a rising role, and buildings will have a more central and active role in the next energy system to come. Energy efficiency first is the foundation of the vision shared by Global ABC members, but policy should be soon extended to include the carbon challenge in the operational phase and in the construction phase if we want to align with the Paris Agreement goals. Currently, only few countries, including France, are implementing building regulation and policy in line with the general content of the IAA Net Zero by 2050 roadmap for the building sector. I will speak a little about France. For instance, as the next year, limits in the level of operational carbon and of embodied carbon in the building material per square meter will be in place in France, and this limit will be reinforced, and it's planned already in 2027 and 2031. This phasing out of fossil fuel energy for heating in new building first, and the development of low embodied carbon solution have been initiated in France. More generally. Moreover, a national plan for energy renovation of the existing building stock has been also implemented. This engagement of the French government cannot be understood without considering the EU rules, which frame the ambition of each member state. Working together, I think it's a help that matters. But buildings are more than merely somewhat complex equipment consuming energy. They are essential infrastructure supporting economic and social life. They need to provide affordable, climate-safe, and comfortable spaces, but also provide cultural value. This requires a policy closely adapted to each local context. And this theme of adaptation to local context, I'm sure, will be touched upon by the expert of today's panel. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Régis. And again, a lot of very substantive points, very important points that I hope we can come back later in the Q&A session. Now, without further ado, I would like to thank once again the opening remarks from our distinguished panelists. And I would like to move to the next phase of this event, inviting my colleague Thibaut Abergel, who is the co-lead analyst for building energy transition technologies at the IEA, to present the key findings related to the building sector and constructions of our net zero by 2050 roadmap. Yeah, Thibault, the floor is yours. I'm going to mute the microphones here, so I hope you're going to have less background noise.
Thank you very much, Luca. Buildings are a prerequisite to build most of our social values, including establishing a family, working, or accessing to healthcare or education. Yet, as highlighted by our Global ABC co-chairs and Tom, they remain highly carbon intensive. And the very fact that the planet cannot afford relying on emissions intensive assets puts buildings and all the services they provide at risk. Therefore, at the IEA, we analyzed what achieving net zero emissions by 2050 entailed for the building sector and how to bring its carbon footprint down to zero or close to zero. But which carbon footprint are we talking about? Total global energy and process-related CO2 emissions amounted to nearly 34 gigatons CO2. Of this, 27% is due to the operational phase of buildings, whether directly through the burning of fossil fuels in buildings to produce heat for space heating, hot water production, and cooking, or indirectly through electricity and commercial heat generation that is later going to be used in buildings. But as Roland highlighted, we mustn't forget the buildings construction industry, the embodied carbon, mostly from the manufacturing of buildings construction materials, which adds 10% on top of operational emissions. It brings the carbon footprint of buildings to 37%. But construction is not only about buildings, it's also about roads and bridges and dams, tunnels, and many things. And the other construction industry is responsible for another 10% on top of this. It means that the built environment together with buildings and infrastructure is responsible for 47% of total global energy and process-related CO2 emissions. So it's an understatement to say that buildings are important to the energy transition. The global energy transition as envisioned in the net zero emissions scenario is underlying a massive market transformation. By end use, for example, space heating today represents most of the final energy use, but its share is drastically reduced by 2050 as envelopes are improved. On the contrary, electric appliances and space cooling, for example, are growing as energy efficiency gains cannot offset the growth for energy service demand. On the fuel side, it means that electricity becomes the primary driver of fuel transformation, with electricity contributing to nearly 2/3 of total final energy use in 2050 in the NZD scenario. Not only the growth of space cooling and electric appliances is contributed to electrification, but also the moving away from fossil fuel technologies, as today about 45 exajoules of coal, oil, and natural gas were used in 2020 to power buildings. The electrification trend needs to be complemented with higher shares of renewables, which is direct biomass, solar thermal, and geothermal, as well as an expansion of district energy systems. The final trend that needs to be highlighted in the NZD scenario is the phase out of traditional use of solid biomass, who was responsible today or every year for 2.5 million premature deaths due to household air pollution. That's more than the malaria every year. It means that by 2030, we are complying with the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 7 on achieving clean energy access. And all of this relies on an overarching target, which is deploying zero carbon ready buildings. A zero carbon ready buildings is a building that do not need further improvement to operate at zero emissions. The first criteria for zero carbon ready building implementation is energy efficiency. Today, about 80 countries have mandatory building energy code requirements in place for new construction. But that means that another 2/3 of the countries actually are lacking these mandatory building energy codes. and that last year, the equivalent of the floor area of France was built outside of any regulation. And even if a country has a code in place, as you can see on this graph, it most often than not doesn't comply with a zero carbon ready building requirement. But in 2030, all buildings for new construction need to comply with this requirement. And on top of this, we need to expand the renovation rate to about 2.5% of the building stock being renovated every year to that level so that we can meet our targets of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. About 50% of the building stock currently today will continue to be standing in 2050. From an energy efficiency perspective, it means that heating and cooling intensities are going to drop by 50 and 25% respectively by 2030. A second criteria for zero carbon ready buildings is the switch to zero emissions fuels. Today, the global heating equipment stock is dominated by fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas boilers. Altogether, 1 billion units are operating. And these are replaced by cleaner technologies, heat pumps in particular, who are driving the demand for new heat demand. In particular, they are supplying for 50% of global building heat demand in 2045, and they are complemented by solar thermal and geothermal technologies and district energy systems. The share of hydrogen remains marginal because of its inefficiencies and because of safety issues to convert the gas grid and make it compatible to running with 100% hydrogen. A third criteria is to take care of the entire life cycle of buildings and especially reduce embodied carbon. Buildings consume a lot of cement and steel, and this consumption has increased a lot since 2000. Even if it dipped in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic as construction activities slowed down, we see that it can rebound to a level that is unprecedented. And in the net zero by 2050 scenario, material efficiency strategies allow to save 10% approximately of the total steel and cement demand relative to baseline trends. These material efficiency strategies span across the entire buildings and construction value chain. But the main lever to reduce material use is extending buildings' lifetime through enhanced renovation, but also from the design stage with higher quality components that will make the building's lifetime longer. It's also a target to make buildings more flexible, to be able to be repurposed at the end of their lifetime. For example, transforming a household into an office to be able to have more flexibility in the repurposing of buildings. Of course, these strategies are complemented with the decarbonization of the industry sector for the production of these materials. The fourth criteria is buildings that need to act within the evolving environment and especially act in concert with the decarbonization of the electricity system. In 2050, 70% of the electricity production is provided by variable renewables. And you can see that the share of demand-side response in intraday electricity system flexibility needs is actually increasing from 5% today in advanced economies to about 25% in 2050. It means that building equipment appliances need to be responsive, especially heating technologies, to be able to integrate as much as viable renewable energy as possible. Of course, there is just not one type of flexibility. In fact, the stability of the grid depends on balancing supply and demand at multiple time horizons, from milliseconds to days to entire seasons, sometimes and at different scales. And in particular, some of these needs are shaping our technology decisions with the need for seasonal storage, especially through geothermal energy. A fifth and last criteria to elaborate on zero carbon ready buildings is climate change adaptation. Here you have one example where we mapped heating and cooling demand globally. And you can see that about 3 billion people live in places where it's hot every single day. And only about 15% of them own an air conditioner today. It means that new buildings need to prevent growth in cooling demand for those people to live more comfortably with enhanced design, passive measures, and of course, a highly efficient and affordable cooling solutions. Global warming is just one effect that needs to be taken into account, but we can imagine many more, such as, for example, rising sea levels, or more often the increased extreme weather events, for example, in the case of storms, which need to be taken into account in building construction codes. As a conclusion, we've mapped out all the different criteria and all the different sub-targets that can be derived from the global target of achieving universal construction of zero carbon ready building energy codes by 2030. These could span from no new fossil fuel boilers in buildings by 2025 to most appliances and cooling systems being best in class by 2035, to half of heating demand met by heat pump in 2045. Of course, each country is free to have its own plans for the transition, and this strategy will depend on its own priorities. But one thing to keep in mind is that this strategy also needs to be compatible with the strategy in place to decarbonize other sectors. In particular, the deployment of material efficiency strategies need to act in concert with the decarbonization of the heavy industry for cement and steel production, for example, so that they could be rewarded at their fair price. In addition, the fact that 60% of total car sales will be electric by 2030 provides an opportunity for buildings to take into account this flexibility potential for their decarbonization through, for example, services like smart charging or vehicle to grid or vehicle to buildings. And most importantly, the decarbonization of the electricity system means that a higher share of variable renewables will be seen as time goes, as we achieve net zero electricity globally in 2040. As conclusions for the policy recommendations, this will be quite simple, and this will reflect quite well what zero carbon ready buildings are. First, we need to pay attention and have regulatory standards requirements on energy intensity, as buildings' energy intensity needs to drop 5 times more quickly over the next 10 years than it did over the past 5. We need to have a life cycle emissions accounting with buildings' life cycle emissions across the entire value chain to be close to zero by 2050. We need system integration, as we have 70% of total global electricity provided by variable renewables, and that electricity makes up for 2/3 of building energy use in 2050. And we need resilience, as more than 70% of global floor area growth to 2050 will occur in places with high space cooling demand. It was a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Global ABC to have the IEA presenting the IEA Net Zero by 2050 roadmap. And you can join the conversation online using the hashtag Buildings Pavilion or at join_global ABC. I remain available to answer your questions by email or live if we have time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thibaut. Very comprehensive, and again, another presentation full of substantive points. I would like to ask the audience if there is any clarification question for Thibaut at the moment, before we go to the panel session. Yeah, please.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Of course, please.
I'm struck by the 47%. My understanding so far was that the 37% includes steel, concrete, etc., also as it goes into infrastructure, which I understand is how you define the built environment, is buildings as well as civil construction. So just this number, so you're saying that 10% is building construction, another 10% is infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It also includes other materials than steel and cement. It's an assessment we did over most materials being used in buildings, which includes, for example, glass, aluminum, chemicals and petrochemicals for insulation, and every type of building equipment we have. And we estimate that the share of buildings in this is 10%, and the share of other construction, that is infrastructure, is an additional 10%.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question as well, and Thibaut for your answer. Any other questions? Please. Can you introduce yourself? Sorry, just quickly a couple of where are you from and your affiliation, your name and affiliation.
Yeah, so for example, the UN Environment Program, their analysis, they talk about a sort of ultimate carbon budget. And that to stay below 1.5, we've got 77% chance to get 340 gigawatts, 400 gigawatts, 500 gigawatts. So as we go from the current building sector footprint, call it 34 gigawatts annually. If you go to 50% by 2030, that gets us to 17. And so I'm curious as to when you take this analysis on reduction percentages by dates, how does it translate into the ultimate actual carbon expenditure from the sector, and how do we relate to that 340, 400, 500? I can't get the building sector to do anything but use all of the allowance with the rates.
Thank you very much. Thibaut, did you get the question?
Sorry, I can't understand. I can't hear actually.
Yeah, I'll try to repeat, and you please let me know. But basically, it's very difficult to reconcile the different numbers that we have out there. There are some analysis from the UN. You take, for instance, the UNEP report. Is that what you're referring to? And then the INA numbers. And so it's difficult to have a sort of a pathway for the expenditure of the whole sector. So how do you see this difference in numbers that are out there?
I'm not exactly sure which differences we are talking about, but I think the easiest to talk it through would be to reach out by email about the sources that are coming from the UN, and then organizing a bilateral meeting to discuss what might be the divergences, whether it's within the scope of what we are accounting for, whether it's because we are only talking about the share of energy and process-related emissions and not GHG emissions, for example, or other things.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Thibaut, and thank you for the question. Now, without further ado, we can go to the next part of the panel, of the session, which is the panel discussion. And we have four distinguished speakers with us. I think all of them, they are connected online. So if your connection allows, I would like to ask you to please also turn on your camera so that we can hear and we can see you. That would be very nice. Thank you very much. So let me introduce them, and then I'll get to the questions for the panelists. And of course, if there are other questions from the audience, you feel free to ask as well. So the first is Chiara Del Mastro. Chiara is an analyst moderator at the IA. Which is leading the buildings technology analysis within the energy technology policy divisions. Then we have Yamina Saheb. She's a research fellow at the University of Münster and a lead author of the upcoming IPCC report. And among others, she's also a fellow IEA colleague. Then we have Ilyas Essabai. He's a renewable energies engineer, and is the head of the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Service at the Ministry of National Territorial Planning and Urban Planning Housing Policy. And then we have Ernest Dion, who is a biologist and a member of the Global Alliance on Buildings and Construction, Global ABC, and also a focal point for the Building Energy Efficiency Program. And he's also worked for the GIZ and AFD in France. So thanks very much for joining us today. And so I'll start perhaps with the first question to Yamina. So we've seen that one of the key measures that were allied by Thibaut is to reduce the demand in buildings. And so in the IPCC report, in the upcoming IPCC report, the role of energy efficiency is also predominant. What are the key areas where reducing demand is absolutely necessary?
Good afternoon. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation to this timely event. I fully agree with Thibault that the first thing to do is to reduce the demand. However, reducing the demand requires efficiency and sufficiency. And what we have been doing in the last 40 years is only efficiency. I will try to explain briefly the difference between the two. Efficiency is about the technological improvement of single component or of the overall building. And over the period 1990 to 2019, efficiency improvement has reduced emissions at the global level by 49%. So the efficiency improvement is something that we can track, is a reality that we can track. However, over the same period, because we did not have sufficiency policies, and I heard Roland making reference to the floor area growth. Actually, it's not the floor area growth that is problematic. What is problematic is the floor area per capita, because the floor area growth is something that is going to continue to happen, especially in developing countries. Most likely, we need less growth in the floor area in developed world because we have enough built environment. We need to repurpose the existing buildings instead of constructing new ones. However, in the developing world, they need to build more buildings. But where we have an issue is that during this period in developed world, we had a high increase in the floor area per capita. In some countries, it's more than double. And this is why the fact that we did not have sufficiency measures has led to increased emissions by 52%. So basically from demand perspective, we had an increase of emissions by 52% and an increase by 52 because of the lack of sufficiency, and a decrease of 49 because of thanks to efficiency improvements, which means in total we have an increase of 3%. So we missed the point during 40 years. And now we need to bring back sufficiency. And sufficiency, actually, when you look at when the IA was created in the 70s, it was about energy conservation. It was not about energy efficiency. It's only 20 years later, when the IA developed our shared goals, that the word conservation disappeared completely and replaced by only efficiency. So yes, to reduce demand, but this is possible only if sufficiency is included. And maybe Régis could say a few words about this, because sufficiency is included in the French energy transition law. And this is the only policy document I know where sufficiency is mentioned as one of the pillars of the transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yamina. Very, very concise, and thank you for your intervention with a lot of good points. I don't know, Régis, if you want to say a couple of words before we can.
Yes, okay. I want only to say that, for instance, our Minister of Housing raised the question about individual housing, and saying that for land consumption, to reduce the impact of extension of the building environment contra the nature preserve land, agricultural land, we should reduce the share of independent houses and going to another type of wealth. That raised a huge debate. So that means, okay, it's a way that you want to promote, and it's not easy way as well, because we have to change a lot of the way we understand our wealth, well-being. So is it to have a garden, or is it to have a quiet space where you can go without any fear? As you have to own it, or you have to share it, be able to share it. So that's a very important social issue. And it's not anymore about technique. That's more like the sufficiency. So very difficult object to tackle.
Yeah.
It's more social. The way to change would be maybe a little longer.
Yeah.
But,
Sure.
But we have to start in that direction.
I think what Yamina suggested is a point that I think we could start discussing for, because there's a whole panel. But thanks for raising that, Yamina. I hope we can have a few moments. I don't want to hold the other panelists now. Next on my list, I would have a question for Chiara. We know that another key trend that Thibault presented is the shift in the mix of technologies that are used in buildings and constructions. Do you think the market is ready to shift to clean energy technologies, and what policies can be put in place to drive this transition?
Thanks, Luca. It's a pleasure to be in this panel, and this question is very interesting and would also require more time, but I'll do my best to condensate some key aspects in 3 minutes. In our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, we see that more than 70% of cumulative emission reduction to 2050 from the building sector results from the deployment of solutions that we already have in the market today. Although most still require innovation to fully integrate them across the diversity of climate and building types. For instance, high-efficient heat pumps are mass-produced today, mostly for use in new construction. Economies of scale would broaden their market potential to retrofit, for example. So what is urgently needed for the building sector is an accelerated deployment of clean energy and envelope technologies that are already available. The challenges are often significant and include both economic and non-economic aspects, and this acceleration depends on stronger policy action and targeted financial support for households, among other measures. To give 3 examples on key policies for the building sector, we need policies that can improve the quality and resilience of our buildings over their life cycle. Floor area in the building sector worldwide, as we heard before, is expected to increase 75% between today and 2050. Through implementing zero carbon ready buildings energy codes, as we heard in the presentation before, and by monitoring their compliance, governments can ensure that the millions of buildings that will be constructed in the next decade will achieve the net zero emission milestones we heard before, as well as will do existing buildings meeting the same standards. This will make our buildings more comfortable and consequently will ease the integration of efficient technologies. And it will also allow lower energy bills for consumers. We also need policies that can accelerate fuel switching and increase efficient technology uptake. While electricity supply is decarbonizing, fossil fuels equipment bans, for example, can accelerate the shift to electrification and to larger renewable integration. In the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, fossil fuel boilers bans are in place already by 2025. And last example is about long-term market signals, which can also derive from incentives, subsidy schemes, and bulk procurement to mobilize upfront capital. If we fail to take action in this decade to drastically deploy clean energy technologies and high-performing envelopes, this would make the later effort to bridge the gap much more difficult and also more expensive. So we look forward to stronger actions in the near term. And back to you, Luca.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I would like, now we have more or less 10 minutes left, and I would like to turn to our next speakers. Perhaps a question to be tackled together to both you, Ilias, and Ernest. So let me know if you want me to switch in French at any point of time. I'd be happy to do so. If you don't understand me, let me know. And I can repeat the questions in French as well. But it would be interesting for us to hear the perspective from you as delegates from developing countries. So what's your view and your vision on which measures you think will be necessary to achieve zero carbon buildings in Morocco and in Senegal? So perhaps I'll first pass it to Ilias, and then Ernest, please.
Thank you. I would like first to thank all the organizers for the invitation to join this event and allowing us to share with you some insights about the building sector transformation that we need to undertake in order to meet Paris Agreement targets. In Morocco, buildings account for 33.6% of final energy consumption, with residential buildings covering 25.4% of final energy consumption. On the one hand, 2/3 of the building stock expected by 2050 is not yet built, in Morocco, which requires a transformation to a low carbon development pathway through efficient new buildings to avoid long-term blockades. On another hand, rapid urbanization and rising incomes are increasing the share of residential energy needs for household equipment, with electricity consumption increasing by an average of 6% per year between 2007 and 2016. Given this context, some measures that seem necessary to me to move towards the deep decarbonization of the building sector in Morocco will have to address the entire value chain and the construction sector from design to construction and operation as part of a holistic and integrated approach. To respect the time that I am allocated, I will cite some of them that seem very relevant to me. First necessary measure is to accelerate the application of the Moroccan Thermal Building Code or thermal regulation. Indeed, despite the fact that Morocco has a mandatory thermal regulation for all new buildings, there is still a certain, let's say, delay in its application. And for this, it will be necessary to overcome all the market barriers that slow down its deployment on a large scale, as like technical control, financial extra costs, informational barriers, etc. And later on, it will be also necessary to consider an improved version of the thermal regulation with gradual stronger requirements, like treating thermal, bridges, ventilation, design, and equipment. The second part is the replacement of the use of the butane for the heating of the sanitary hot water and the solar water heating and electric cooking, also powered by solar photovoltaic. And in order to achieve that, we need to reform butane subsidy scheme. Indeed, the subsidy to the butane gas is one of the main obstacles for the development of the energy saving solution for the cooking and the sanitary hot water in buildings. For this, an idea would be to, for example, to allocate yearly and progressively a share of the subsidies to the butane gas for the financing of the solar water heaters and photovoltaic solar panels. Third measure is to develop photovoltaic solar roofs on a large scale through the opening of low voltage market and the possibility of injecting electricity into the network. Also to generalize minimum energy performance standards on all domestic electrical appliances, and also establish renovation programs for existing buildings. And finally, national label dedicated to energy efficiency to attract both the private sector and the end-use consumers.
Thank you very much, Ilyas. Ernest, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Luca. You hear me? You hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank the International Energy Agency to invite me in this event. And to answer directly to your question, I said that your economies in Senegal face some major challenge in achieving carbon neutrality for the building and construction sector. And I think, you hear me?
Yes, but can you speak a little bit closer to the microphone, please, if you can?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think you need to share 5 measures. The first is to have a public policies to support energy efficiency, the development of renewable energy, the development of the local based and geo-based materials, and the standardization of this material. This is the first measure. The second is to increase the production and the use of the based materials by supporting the production infrastructure and to have to support the capacity building of stakeholders. The second measure is to support the public and private sustainable construction sector to create large markets. And the last, for me, measure is to provide appropriate funding to support the national initiative. In Senegal, like, I can see you one example in Senegal. The government decided to build in the 5 next years 100,000 units for peoples. And I think this project need to be supported by appropriate financing. And you can use this initiative to develop the increase the measure of decarbonization of the sector. This is, I think, that I want to think to answer your question. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ernest, and thanks to all the panelists. I'm afraid we have just 5 minutes left, so I wanted to perhaps open the floor if there are any questions. Please, can you introduce yourself, say your name and your affiliation, and then thank you.
My question is for Roland. My name is Julie Hiramoto, and I'm here with the American Institute of Architects. You mentioned the City Business Climate Alliance, CBCA, in your opening remarks, and I live in Dallas, Texas. And the city is very proud to be included in this program in a very small number of cities. I was there at the launch in August, along with some of the leaders of my firm, HKS, and hearing the astronomical numbers that Thibault shared with us, I'm curious to know what expectations there are for the built environment and what frameworks may already be in place within that program to help propel the change that we need.
Thank you for that excellent question, and it's great to hear that connection we already have in CBCA. I think what Carl mentioned is fundamental. I mean, we have a remaining carbon budget, and if we look at the share of the built environment in there, we know, and we can debate these numbers, but we need to reduce by at least 50% by 2030. So any building project today that gets off the ground will probably finalized by 2030. So we already today have to have these design numbers whenever we build. So WCSD, what we have done is this whole life carbon assessment. Let's look at all the numbers. We did a report, we call it Net Zero Buildings, Where Do We Stand? And very few projects today do a whole life carbon assessment. Less than 1% is our estimate. Probably much less than 1%. And what that work shows is where the emissions are. So full approach, is it in the materials, is it in the refurbishment, is it in the energy use? And then it allows us to look at how do we reduce those to the targets that we need to have, for example, by 2030. Well, so that's the kind of work that needs to happen. But also back to Yamina's point, where cities and business, so you're in the construction business, you design buildings, you need to work together on, so what does this mean for our city? And how do we start setting ourselves in tune with those limitations we will have in the future? That's why Regis mentioned also in France, starting to look at how do we look at the embodied carbon and start to regulate it and limit it. It needs that discussion. So business cannot do this alone. Individual business cannot do it alone, but they can work across the supply chain. But it also needs to work with the city. So I think the example you give with Dallas is excellent. So we need that city business collaboration to really drive it. So yeah.
Thinking, what is a net zero building when you are in the city? Is it, for instance, okay, we don't look at the context, or we should say, okay, we miss the point, renovate the building. So the net zero reference, is it the one where you renovate the building, when you create a new building? So the question is net zero question in the local context.
Yeah, we have to do both, right?
Yeah, but that means that when you invest, have you really look at the opportunity to buy an existing building and renovate it, to extend it, and something? So not to have a build and say, oh, it's net zero. It's not net zero.
So we have to start with that first because the infill also built our transportation densification, and the quality of our cities too.
Exactly. Yeah. yeah, this opens up. I'm afraid we have 1 minute to discuss also the urbanization challenge, but everything is interconnected. I totally agree. I don't know if there is any other final questions, perhaps in the room. Yes, please. Again, can you please introduce yourself and?
So FIDIC is a international association of engineering and industries.
Speak up. I don't think. Yeah.
So Idriss Katrada from FIDIC. FIDIC is a. Yeah, thank you. So I'm Idriss Katrada from FIDIC. FIDIC is an international engineering association, and of course there is a built environment, but there is also the nature in which this built environment is set up. So to what extent could the nature bring some solutions either for mitigation or adaptation? Yes, it's open question if there is any comment on this topic.
Any of the panelists wants to tackle this question about the role of nature in mitigation and adaptation in the built environment? Does any of you want to say a couple of words? Please.
About the document. If you want to be very efficient, you need to have a quiet surrounding.
Yeah.
That's very simple. But it's not very easy sometimes to have a quiet surrounding. So as you don't have a quiet surrounding, you are not able to build by bioclimatism solution natural ventilation and crossing ventilation because you have noise, for instance. That's why when you have a buffer of vegetation, green, it's a natural-based solution, but that as well a filter and buffer for sound and sun. So I think that you're right. You need to integrate to have the best of the bioclimatism as well.
Anyone from Yamin? I've seen that you unmuted yourself. Do you want to intervene?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. It was the role of nature-based solutions for adaptation and mitigation in the built environment.
Yeah, so they have an important role to play. And actually, when I was speaking about sufficiency, among the sufficiency measures is to integrate the nature at the first stage when you are designing a building. And this is usually has been forgotten because we had we thought for years that with technologies that we could do whatever we want, then we could compensate with technologies. But we see today that there are initiatives where we go back to integrate more nature. So they have an important role to play. However, at this stage, we cannot quantify yet the mitigation potential of nature-based solutions.
Yeah, that's completely true. And again, this would be a very interesting topic for another session, but I'm afraid that we are running out of time. So I would like to thank everyone who participated to this very interesting discussion. To me, this opened like a lot of questions that I think all of us together can work to try to tackle in the next years. I'm very glad to see one picture here on the wall. I don't know if there are more speakers. It's from my hometown, Milan, and it's apparently it's a very sustainable building, not only green but even very efficient. So and I'm not sure if it's net zero, but it's a very efficient one. So I hope in the future we are all gonna go towards that. And I would like once again to thank everyone for having participated. And with that, I would like to close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.